The motion brought forth is that this House regrets dominant narrative of good trumping over evil in children's fiction. Without any further ado, I'd like to call the Prime Minister to open the debate for us.
Madam Chair, we believe in the gray area. We believe that people aren't just good or evil and that dichotomy is false. We believe that people are a lot of different things, and teaching people that they have to be one or the other is meaningfully harmful to how we interact with each other, to how we interact with ourselves. We're going to be telling you that we regret this dominant narrative on two different ideas. Firstly, how it harms the individual child themselves. Secondly, how it harms broader society and the interactions that happen there. But onto a couple of points of context. We tell you that the narrative of good triumphing over evil and those two things being easily identifiable is almost exclusive in children's literature. We don't think that there are many other stories that are in any other realm. So we don't think we ever see evil triumphing over good, or those two things not being too easy to identify. Like, we're not sure what actually happens here, or the conclusion is bittersweet, for example, right? So we tell you that that's incredibly important. Given the narrative and the power of fiction to normalize ideas, so we think it's incredibly important that fiction has the ability to tell you and influence what you think of as right and wrong. And that stays with you for many years to come, right? So it's influential in terms of shaping your calculus, your moral calculus, and how you interact with society. It's important to note that there is a very direct and clear disjunct between children's fiction and the real world. It does not mimic it in any shape or way, right? Good does not always win in the real world, and equally, it's not easy to identify who the good and bad guys are in the real world. We think when you tell children that that's the case, it meaningfully impacts the us versus them dichotomy, and that's really harmful, right? So we're going to be telling you two things. That we regret this on principle, on 4 levels, and that we regret this in terms of the practical portrayal and how that manifests within today's literature, right? In principle, we tell you that we should reject dichotomies within children's literature, that there is a gray in between, and that is a false dichotomy that you give that does not exist in the real world. It does not portray reality to say that there are good guys and there are bad guys, and that's very clear, and that's exactly how we identify. We think that allows for absolutism and for otherism within our society and within our own children, right? Why? Because when we tell a story, we naturally identify as the good guys, right? We are the ones who think that we are doing the right thing. Nobody really ever thinks that they are the bad guys in their own stories. So we think it's natural that these children identify themselves as the good guys, as the heroes or heroines of that story, and they always think that they specifically are doing the right things. We think when you give that information to people, you say that we are the good guys and everybody that is not like us is the bad guys, that they are identifiable and that they are inherently evil in terms of their specific role in society, right? We think that that is not a good dichotomy to have. Motivations are complex. It's notable that you can be both things. Someone who has done a bad thing is capable of good, and equally someone who has done many good things is capable and fallible in terms of their actions. Yeah. We think that gray area is incredibly important when you evaluate moral calculuses and when you tell people what is and isn't right, okay? Secondly, we tell you that we would reject a dominant narrative in terms of information. So we think that this sort of monopolization of information is meaningful in terms of evaluating that moral calculus, right? So we don't value, like North Koreans being told one thing is real and that believing that that is reality, and then not having an ability to meaningfully critique their government, not having an ability to meaningfully interact with the world. Equally, we tell you, when you have one dominant portrayal, you tell them that that is reality. You tell them that a false reality is meaningful and impactful. That's how they should view moral calculus. No. We think that that's incredibly important because real choices aren't clear choices between good and evil. Real choices are important in the gray area, and it's about your actions. It's about how you actually choose, right? So we think that's important. Those well-reasoned choices within the gray area are what we value. It's important, thirdly, because we think we gain moral legitimacy from actually evaluating the circumstances, from actually evaluating good versus evil, how those things actually work, right? It's important to note that that doesn't accrue based on just saying the good will always win out, and therefore, like, you are the good person and you should always win out and these people should lose. That's important. What we tell you then is that it also allows for, so that's just on a principled level. Yeah, I'll take the honor.
I think you fundamentally mischaracterize the sort of narratives that are there, the stories that are told. Most of the time there is an evil, when we look at like the minions, right? The actual villain in itself actually trumps them at the end. So stories in themselves, even if there's evil, end up doing the good or speaking about the good.
Okay, but in that circumstance, it's a gray area. It isn't necessarily like an identifiable good that triumphs over an identifiable evil. Like, those are the complexities that we're talking about, where it isn't so easy to figure out who is evil and who is good, right? That's important. What we tell you then is that the practical portrayal of how people are actually viewed within that society, like, that's exactly the anti-hero that we're kind of talking about. But anyway, so practical portrayals are important, right? We tell you that good is often associated with where you are born and what your identity is in that society. That's fundamentally harmful. We tell you that people aren't born good or evil, and thinking so is incredibly damaging, especially at the point where these things are largely corresponded with some kind of privilege within a society, right? So we think that's incredibly important. What is good associated with in children's literature? It's associated with things like beauty, like royalty, for example, like what color you are in that society. What we tell people then is if they're born into that color, or if they're born as royals, or if they're born into privilege, they have the ability to deserve good things from that society, and nobody else does. Moreover, we tell you that other people deserve condemnation within that society. They deserve bad things to happen to them because they are the bad guys in your societal story. That's incredibly damaging, right? We think it actually legitimizes the kind of discrimination that occurs within a society and is meaningfully harmful to how people view other people that are different to them. That's important because humans are complex. They are valuable in terms of how they actually interact with society and the choices they make. What you tell them in terms of this portrayal is that that one identity or that one identifiable trait makes them evil or makes them good, right? So we think it allows for people to condemn people who have made like one wrong choice in their lives. We think this relates meaningfully to things like criminality. If someone was a criminal in their youth, for example, they don't necessarily deserve to rot in jail for the rest of their life. They're not capable of any good in the rest of their lives. It is complex. It is difficult to accrue what that moral calculus means. That people who have made mistakes in their lives are also able to accrue good. So it's important that you don't condemn people to a certain role within that society and be prescriptive, especially when it's based on identifiable traits, identifiable characteristics. That's especially damaging, right? So because we reject the binary, because we reject that you can easily identify what good and evil is and apply that to reality, because we think it leads to an internalization of that damaging moral dichotomy, we would say that we want a rise of the gray area within narratives. We want the anti-hero. We're very proud to propose.
We'd like to thank the Prime Minister. We'd now like to welcome the Leader of Opposition to open the op case.
They bring up 3 points in this debate, but because of the complex nature of narrative and human society and the soul, we have to give our matter first before we fundamentally rebut them. But just so that they know we're going to rebut them, we're going to rebut the idea of the monopolization of values. Secondly, that these children's stories have no fundamental gray area. And thirdly, that this encourages people to form rigid moral dichotomies in the real world. And we don't think that that's true. But what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to drop some odd ideas that don't really come up in debating. So I'm going to talk about how life is actually meaningless, ladies and gentlemen. That's one. Two, I'm going to talk about the fact that these have the ability to imbibe progressive values, and these are one of the only forms of media that do. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about the function of narratives in everyday society. What do I mean by life is meaningless? I don't really want to get forth, so let me explain, right? So these glasses are here to make me seem clever, despite the fact that I don't need them. Yucca has the function of making me drunk, right? These are all objects within society. They've got defined meanings, defined roles, defined purposes. These are what objects are. They've got internal essences about them. But human beings themselves are subjects, right? What a subject has is they don't have any defined meaning, purpose, or role. When we talk about objectification of women, that's inherently wrong because you place women as an object that fundamentally have a purpose, which is to satisfy men. Objectification of blackness in general is inherently wrong because it poses that the function of blackness is to be subordinate to whiteness. What we talk about in children's narrative is that they create subjectification by forcing moral identification with the character, regardless of whether that character is a rat, as in Ratatouille, or whether it's a lion, as in The Lion King. We understand that their idea that this is they have this false notion of reality, which is why people are often forced to identify with animals directly to remove the harm that they spoke of in that first point that they brought up there today. What we find is that although they do claim that they value things such as beauty and royalty, like the ugly duckling goes directly against that. So does Cinderella. When you look at children's narratives, Mulan, Pocahontas, and Princess and the Frog are one of the few examples of media that have women of color, right, the most oppressed people in society, as the main actors. With the normal, filmed action films, you find that women are generally the reward for the male protagonist once he achieves his goal. What we find is this internal subjectification manages to show kids, despite the fact that life doesn't have these clear narratives and meanings, is that despite the meaninglessness of life and that we don't have defined purposes, one can create one's own purpose. One has the ability to liberate oneself. This is subjectification, the opposite of objectification. The term self-actualization is often bandied around in debating, but self-actualization is the core idea of this thing. Secondly, we're going to talk about progressive values. Because they don't directly fall into this moral gray area, they've got a lot more room to handle these sort of things. Because you always automatically identify the subject, it forces the child to go out of their normal cultural context. When they bring up the point of monopolization, which we love, it's not as much monopolization as it's the fact that these films embody universal values. I can go to Up or Utopia and cry my eyes out, right, and lose my date, because fundamentally these films still speak to me. People all over the world eat these films up because they talk to these universal human values that are inherently important for self-actualization of children. When we find that Timon and Pumbaa show that two dads can fundamentally raise Simba, these are fundamentally progressive values. This is something that's really, really good. They show an African narrative story, which is great, and the narrative doesn't happen with a simple triumph of good over evil. We find that the moral gray areas of the villain aren't quite real. When you look at Syndrome, right, in The Incredibles, so I watch a lot of cartoons, right? So when it comes to Syndrome, he was a good guy who became really, really bitter and salty, and therefore became evil, right? We find that when it comes to Scar, despite the fact he liberated the hyenas in Lion King, right, he still has inherent moral badnesses about him. They directly go inside this gray area, and they allow a simplification that allows people to explore these narratives in a deep and meaningful way. There isn't this deep dichotomy because often the main hero is an anti-hero who is bad but does good things, such as the main supervillain who's actually the good guy in Despicable Me. What we find is that we want to talk about how children learn at the end of the day. As we spoke, that like children who don't have any defined values, they're inherently subjects. What this means is that they need guide paths in order to learn. What these moral narratives do is they imbibe moral principles with children. We find these moral principles as inherently good, and they find that they give children hope that even if they undergo hardship, the vast majority of Disney characters are orphans, they can still triumph. When life is meaningless, we need hope. These narratives are really important, and when religion doesn't give people the same hope as it once did, and Santa doesn't have the same value, we find that we need these children's stories in order to ascribe moral values to children within our society as a whole. Go, Athi.
So, it may be true, life might be meaningless, but when these stories create the narrative to other particular peoples or groups who are supposed to be innately evil, they make out of the subjects you desire objects to be disposed of, objects to be dictated over. And so you defeat the very thing you want via the narrative.
We find that that could be applicable if often that the evil villain within most stories didn't come from the very same in-group as the hero. They've got direct categorization and they directly interact with each other, and there's the different choices that they make define them as good or evil. They aren't evil because they're lions or because they're hyenas. They're evil because of their actions. It gives them the ability and children to surpass the normal objectification that society places upon them and allows them to find true meaning. We find that because the world is harsh, we don't want to throw them into the deep end. We need moral narratives in order to teach people about the way the world works. We find that with babies, parents don't teach babies every single word in the dictionary. They don't teach them how to speak. They define the vague conceptualization of good, which is acquiring language, and the babies do so themselves. This is how we learn in society. This is how we generally socialize. And these sort of processes get us ready to socialize. When a narrative indirectly attaches to a subject or moral good, this is what Slavoj Žižek defined as the sublime object of ideology. This is one of the things that allow people to defy objectification and create
It's funny how Devon never got to any of his rebuttal, leaving entire of Ansuya's case standing. Devon, when you prioritize your matter, you leave actual analysis behind. Therefore, opening opposition is already losing today's debate. Secondly, we apologize to him for his depressed state because we don't think today's debate is about whether or not life is meaningless or not. But I will show you how we make even those things worse when we tell good people that whenever they lose, it's bad for them because, hey, I was supposed to win as a good child, but I'm impoverished. That damages my life. We're the ones that are better for those children. Let's analyze the case of what they brought us. Everything they told you were fiction stories that are subverting the narrative, right? So they talk about things like Princess and the Frog and about Ugly Duckling. Those aren't the norms we are talking about. Those are specifically the differences that we want in this case. Your entire debate is supporting us because all your examples are examples of the actual differences in fiction as opposed to the real fiction. Secondly, we told you in Ansuya's speech how we can regret the way in which this narrative has been portrayed. That was a very important line in our matter, right? So we can regret what fiction in the past has defined as good, and what fiction in the past has defined as evil. When fiction tells us that a witch is evil just because she's a witch, for no reason, based on no circumstance, she's evil because she she was born that way, right? Not because of her circumstances, not because of who she is. She's just evil. While Snow White is good because she's beautiful, right? But fiction tells us what must happen to evil people. Evil people must burn. Evil people must die, right? This ties into the ideas of when we associate identity with specific things. We say that specific groups in society are bad, and bad things must happen to them, as opposed to engaging in the complexity of identity and the complexity of what life is about. And Sia told you all these things in her speech, and you chose to ignore her, to take a seat. The only other thing it talks about is that, well, we need to create hope in children, and I'll deal with this from a positive matter. Before I get there, let's just rehash three things. One, the first thing we say is that we can regret the principle that good triumphs over evil. This debate is about the principle of good triumphing over evil. It is not about if fiction stories are good or bad. That's not our debate in today's debate. Should we tell people that good will always win, and there's no circumstance in which good just loses? Because there is. Poor kids in Somalia, no matter how good you are losing. That is a reality, right? We have to engage in that reality as opposed to neglecting it. The second thing we say is that we don't want identity to be conflated with importance. So we don't want to say, because you are this, you are automatically evil. There's an important gray area in which I can be selfish and hopeful and cool. I'm a complex human. I'm not just good, I'm not just evil. And we discard those binaries. You just accept them. Take a seat. The last thing we say, that we would never prescribe identity. We tell that information is valuable in making a good choice. Children only believe in something if they're actively making that choice themselves. If they have enough information to choose between what kind of narratives they want to believe in. Up until the point where we don't have the opposite reality, we are just prescribing to them, reinforcing them with doctrine. The very religion you're against is what you do when you say that good and evil will always, that good will always triumph over evil. You guys haven't come to the debate, so I'm going to continue extending our matter by analyzing two very important things. First thing I want to analyze is how do these things manifest practically. The second thing I'll question is what the fudge is good and what the fudge is evil. Let's move on to the first issue of how do these things manifest practically. Because the idea is today's debate is about triumph, right? Telling kids that no matter the circumstance, Superman will always come out on top. That no matter the circumstance, good should always win. Is that reality? We say when good people can still starve, right? When bad things can still happen to good people. But in real society, good always loses. Israel and Palestine is a very good example. When we say that the reality of society is that good always wins, what this creates is a very harsh reality in which it's worse to accept when bad things happen to you because you feel entitled to good things, right? So what this means is that you think you're always supposed to get ahead in life, you're always supposed to be better in life because you're intrinsically good, as opposed to accepting that sometimes bad things just happen. Secondly, it gives false hope to situations. So in the same way we wouldn't tell a sick person that you're going to survive, we're giving them false hope, it's harder for them to rationalize when they actually get worse and they get sicker. In the same circumstance, we wouldn't tell good people that bad things will never happen to you because it gives you false hope in your circumstance. It doesn't allow you to stop actualizing that case. And therefore you can't accept when bad things really do happen to you. The last thing that we'll say, please take a seat, is that we will allow for that diversity within your own mentality of what you want to value, right? So we say that we have to actually prepare kids for the reality of life. That in many circumstances, things aren't just good and evil. So virginity isn't just good and evil. These are choices you have to make by weighing up your own personal circumstances and what is important to you. At a point in which we just prescribe that good must always triumph over evil, we don't allow kids to engage in this reality. We don't prepare them for the reality of the world in the actual fact. I'll take close.
In the 2008 blockbuster Happy Feet, the producers decided to frame the problem as the fetishization of indigeneity by whiteness, and the triumph there was the penguins all coming together to overcome this dictatorship by galvanizing politically. Tell us why that dichotomy is a bad one.
We say that that's okay. Just have another story where that doesn't happen. It doesn't stop you from having those stories. Just create more stories in which different narratives exist. That's the entire debate, right? And furthermore, this isn't about just like good or evil. It's about how that good and evil is portrayed. You guys aren't engaging with our reality. Now the last question of what is good and what is evil. But here we tell you that in these stories, remember, we are regretting the past, not the future. So in these past stories, Superman has had to undergo the very same things the evil people do in order to paint. So what is the actual difference between that good and evil when we don't really create it, when we don't really have it being implemented in society? So we say that good and evil is one thing when it really isn't. When people use the same mechanisms to achieve different goals in society, but that's legitimate just because you are Superman, that's illegitimate just because you're the clown. I think that's a bad reality to have in society, when there isn't actually good, when there isn't actually evil, but it's more complex than that. It's a gray area that we need to introduce to kids. So what do we tell you in today's debate? We tell you on a principled level, we reject this idea of good triumphing over evil. But on a practical level, of how this has been carried out in the past, we regret it too. I'm very proud to propose.
Would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. Would now like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the off case.
Madam Speaker, we need to look at the actors that we speak about in this debate. These are not individuals who rationalize things because they inherently just understand something. These are individuals with minds that need to be molded. Individuals who need to be guided in terms of certain values and morals in society that exist. What they want us to do is to have a certain void of individuals and then allow a 6-year-old to determine for themselves what is good or bad. We don't necessarily think that those individuals understand or have the capacity to make those rational decisions that they think we should make within societies. We think that's fundamentally flawed for you to say that a 6-year-old somehow has that progressive mindset to decide when or where in the spectrum that they want to be. Why does Devon tell you that when we have these different narratives, it allows these individuals, these kids, to identify with that certain individual or certain animal or ratatouille or whatever animal it is? Because why? They look at traits in which they themselves can connect with in these certain stories. The context must be there for the individuals to understand what they're doing. We don't like this gray area because gray area puts in an interpretation which could lead to harmful stuff. We don't like that you want to speak about the interpretation, right? So Devon tells you some nice stuff, which unfortunately Bettina as well, because I think she was rushing for positive matter, skips and speaks about, Somalian children and how we shouldn't tell them those sort of things. But let me go into her speech, right? And this is sort of like OG's case. I want to start with that example to say what we do when we don't tell individuals or these kids that bad things happen is fundamentally bad. I think what Bettina misses, and a lot of what the analysis doesn't look at, is the nature at which these stories are told, right? So in the story doesn't mean that evil necessarily doesn't happen, right? So when Simba's father dies, the child gets an example of evil happening and identifying what evil is within their lives, right? But what happens as well is a bit of a glimpse of what life is. You don't go and tell a 6-year-old child that to some degree, like having cancer is a very bad thing. It's things that we don't tell these individuals because we understand that they don't have sufficient capacity to put it within that context. That's why we have these stories that have a thing like the Minions, right? Where the bad guy eventually becomes or is seen as someone that's good. Because there is a context and a narrative within that. Even if they want to say that witch in itself is always seen as bad, no. That witch in itself can change its identity in order to be a good individual within society. We think it's fundamentally bad that you think that these stories just say there's a good and bad and no middle. The middle is the change that individuals can go through. But let's go on to another fundamental thing, right? What they lie to you about is that somehow what kids learn at 6 stays with them like totally in the rest of their lives, right? At 12 years old, I wanted to be like an archaeologist because I thought archaeology was like the best thing ever. But what happens as you grow as an individual? Your identity is shaped by different narratives in which you live in, different contexts that you need to be. So even if we want to say that these stories shape how kids think in life, we speak about the values and the morals that it gives them, the good or the bad. Kids grow up and shape their identity by different things that happen within their life when they start rationalizing as individuals and as teenagers, right? That's what we look at. So the identity that you want to say that we always look at these individuals as bad is wrong, because as we grow up, we learn new identities and we refine our identity by the context at which we live in and the narrative that we live in. For fun, sit down. Athi.
Are you suggesting that children who grow up, for example, in Western Sahara, don't have the mechanism to read the world wherein good things happen, bad things happen, and they happen to just about anyone?
Athi, you've run that whole line in this debate where you want us to justify that black people cannot understand stuff that is a lie. But let me tell you why. Essentially, even in those contexts, let me tell you why we still think that the narrative of good versus evil is justified, right? So when we look at children that live in these war-torn areas, as Bettina wants to say, right, that live in a literal virtual reality of evil, what do we always do, right? And this is like an example as well. Okay, let me not use this example, it's very wrong. What do we do in normally those situations? Even in a bad situation, Madam Speaker, we always look for the good in it, right? As individuals in society, right? So even though I am looking at like, I live in a shack or whatever, I always want to find something that speaks of goodness or happiness or something that at least makes me forget about the realm in which I live in. So that's why we say, even in the narrative that you want to use, these individuals, these children that live in bad situations, right, always, like the kids that live in bad situations, always look for a good, something that is different within the context that they live in. We can't just tell them that your life will always be like a mess up, right? That is not how you socialize children. That is not how you teach individuals that you want to be meaningful contributors in society to live. We think that that identity in itself changes. Let me take Bettina.
So what we're regretting is the past day in which goodness has been achieved. Goodness has been achieved by marrying the prince. Goodness has been achieved by being beautiful. Regret the actual portrayal of good and evil, our entire case.
The fundamental thing is that you want us to say it's always one or the other. We say that there is a mirage at some times. Even though there are dichotomies, there is a mirage where these things can mix. Your lie is that you want to say it's always one or the other. No, we tell you that within those stories as well, the context normally changes in order to shape stuff that happen. But let me go on to things that we need to speak about. So why do we also think that the narrative must be spoken about or must be a dominant? Because that's the problem they don't tell us, right? It's a dominant narrative. We need to understand why dominant narratives in themselves are bad. There's nothing that they tell us that this narrative is bad. But what we speak about is the protection of these children, right? You need to understand that these are young, moldable minds that we need to inculcate some sort of values within, right? It's not individuals that have like amazing capacity in order to decide what they want. We need the protection of kids and to acclimatize the kids. That's why we have these stories, right? To acclimatize kids to things that virtually happen in real life. You can't just tell them that this is just an evil thing or like give them the raw evilness of life. It's just not good for you to do that, right? So what do? We have these stories that acclimatize kids to what is good and what is evil. The context normally changes as well in which individuals identify. But as well, right? So you want to say, like, there's always a witch. Devon does tell you that in these stories, these kids are able to relate and then choose this identity that they want to live in, right? Whether they want to be an evil guy or they want to be a good guy, that is a choice. But the dichotomy as well is good for the moral values that we instill in these children. We've told you that these actors that we speak about are young, impressionable beings that need to be protected. We acclimatize these kids to the understanding of the realm of life, not what they want you to speak about, where kids are in a bubble of gray area, where they literally can't make a decision about what is happening. These are children that we're speaking about, Madam Speaker. For those reasons, we're glad to
Would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Now I'd like to welcome the Member of Government to open the second half of the debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So, Nell was right when he accuses Athi and I of continuously preaching the gospel that says that you should stop lying to and dehumanizing black people. And we're going to preach that gospel one last time. Because if you are a black child in the United States, you are at least 30% likely to end up being expelled from school, ending up in jail over non-violent offenses, or being shot by a police officer, and you are more likely to have those things happen to you as a child than you are to actually finish high school to begin with. And if you ask yourself, as I have many times, how the United States came to have such an evil and oppressive system, it was through passing of the laws such as the school-to-prison pipelines, whereby you can arrest children on incredibly minor offenses, and you can keep building prisons, and you can keep passing fundamentally racist legislation. But the way that people like Hillary Clinton crafted the system was through a characterization of black children which painted them as being fundamentally evil. So what she would talk about is how these drug-crazed youths are dangerous, they come with a crazed look in their eyes, and the word she uses to describing them as hyper-predators, and something which is fundamentally subhuman and something we need to protect ourselves against. It is scary to see her describe children in that way. And I think that was a bit long, but I think it's important to think about that and then contrast that to the speech you hear in Leader of Opposition. Because perhaps if you are a white middle-class boy who just loves cartoons, it's easier to understand childhood as an incubator where you are shielded from the real world and you only really start engaging with the world on your own terms once you've imagined yourself whatever way you please. But black childhood, we will tell you, is a myth. Black childhood is an oxymoron, and if you read in the media how they describe the brutalization and the killing of our black children, if you rewatch Disney movies and see how they sexualize women of color in a way that they never do to white women, because in that instance they want to preserve the view of innocence, and think about it, movies like Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, you will notice that children's books absolutely must teach black children about the real world in which they live, because for them it is a matter of survival. After this fairly long introduction, I have 4 points of extension. First of all, we think it's incredibly important to recognize that yes, children's books do determine how much ambition a child is able to have, but that this doesn't happen in the utopian world Opening Opposition describes it. Where it actually happens, the context in which children's books are telling children what they should believe is under a context of racial apartheid of children's literature, where an actual scary number, like above 90% of characters in children's books are actually white children. Above 90% of the characters in white children's books are actually middle-class children. So the reason, so when Opening Opposition talks about The Princess and the Frog, which is a ridiculously offensive characterization of what blackness is in the first place, the only reason that is exceptional is because that little girl is the only black princess in the history of Disney, and the standard that children's books portray is that, yes, good does triumph, but what the good looks like and who the heroes are people who look like you if you are white, but do not look like you if you are black. And this is something which is already crippling the self-esteem of these children in that place. And the consequences of this are threefold. The first is it perpetuates a massive issue of a white savior complex, which means that where white people inherently view themselves as being the courageous people who must go out and save the blacks and insert themselves in every discussion, in every issue, in every problem, and lead the way because of their unique skills and their unique creativity. Or something crazy like that. To be honest, I don't know how they think. But this is also the sort of like political policy entitlement, which means that the West must go over and infantilize and save Africa and not allow them to run their own affairs. But it also has two other harmful conclusions I'll take you when I finish the point, which is that it portrays white mediocrity as excellence. And it creates a standard that says that these people, just by the virtue of you being a child child and your heart being in the right place, you can do anything you want to. And then the converse of that, which is the last conclusion, is that it makes a standard of black exceptionalism as a duty. And we think it's incredibly important when Bell Hooks comes up and says the only demand, or the biggest demand of black feminists, is that we be allowed to be mediocre. But you cannot be mediocre in black, you cannot be mediocre in female, you have to be exceptional, otherwise you're not human.
The problem is that the context, we want to put color to the context. If we have two characters who are gray, you can still give the notion that good times over evil without having color in it.
No, so the problem is if you're saying that good... If you're saying that, so yes, it's not only limited, I'm talking narrowly about a part of the motion, but if you're talking about good versus evil, if the way you portray good as always being white, that is important for exactly the reason that there was such a controversy over the Nina Simone biopic, because casting of who you reflect as being allowed to play a specific role is something which determines the ability of the consumer to relate to that character to begin with. The second thing I want to point out is that this portrayal of good versus evil is almost always acontextual, in that it doesn't reflect how different contexts actually shape the likelihood of people being successful. Because what it tells you is that evil resides within you and not the system, or it resides within you and not the world in which you live. And this is incredibly problematic when a caricatured understanding of evil means that you always assume, for instance, that your threat of being raped will come from a grimy character coming out of a dark alley, whereas it is more likely to be someone living within your own home. We think that the ability for a simplistic characterization of good versus evil dulls your senses to question the people around you and ask, where is the good and where is the evil in my own life and in my own society? And this is something which crucially allows and forces people to evaluate themselves and whether they are part of a bigger evil design. We think it is incredibly important that children's books start representing more of the real world, and that when they do portray these exceptional stories, that they stop doing so in a way which is fundamentally racist. We're very proud to propose.
To extend the off case. Order, please.
This House regrets the dominant narrative of good triumphing over evil in children's fiction. And I have to repeat the motion because there's need to have a talk about what the burdens on each side as a result of this debate, right? Opposition does not have to defend racist caricatures of evil, right? That's the point, right? That opposition has no obligation to do that. The question of whether good versus evil in itself as idea is bad or not and ought to be portrayed versus children's stories is very different from racist portrayals of what evil looks like, from sexist portrayals of what evil looks like. We don't have to defend that. We think the government has been, oh, well, too bad for them. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you a few things, right? I'm going to talk to you about the dichotomy in good versus evil. I'm going to talk to you about moral education of young people and why it is that it's necessary to have it in those forms, right? So that's largely what my madam will talk about. So let's do a bit of rebuttal, though, before I get into that, right? So what Elisha tells you in his speech is that it says, the problem with this is that it says evil resides within you and you are the person who's evil, right? We tell you that the fundamental point of those stories and teaching those stories is that you must always aspire to goodness as opposed to you aspiring to evil, right? We tell you that tells you that the decision resides within you to be good and to be an evil person, right? And especially if you look at instances such as, I don't know, Cinderella and the stepsisters where they all reside in the same house, and they all grow up around each other, yet some are good, some are evil. We tell you that that means that it tells the people that it is you that makes the decision to be good and evil, and you ought to always aspire to goodness, right? We tell you that there's nothing wrong with that, even if in many instances, like being good may not always give you good outcomes. We tell you that it in itself is something that's always good to aspire towards. We tell you that there's nothing wrong with teaching our children that they always ought to aspire towards goodness and being good people, right? We tell you, so what you hear from Nero's speech is that children in themselves are young and are unable to have very complex decisions around a lot of the gray areas that Ansuya tells you, that Ansuya speaks about. We tell you that this is important in closing our position and extension, right? We tell you that the point of children's stories and children's fiction is to teach short, targeted moral lessons, right? So Beauty and the Beast teaches you not to judge someone based on their, like, tells you that people can be good even if they don't look the way in which everyone else or people aren't beautiful, right? We tell you things like The Ugly Duckling tells you that people do transform and, like, you always ought to value what's good inside. We tell you that that's what children's fiction does, right? It teaches short-term, small moral lessons, right? It doesn't teach you the entirety of being good or being bad. Go away. It doesn't teach you the entirety of being bad, being good. We tell you that it's important to teach them in dichotomies, right? Where you're talking about good versus evil in that limited way, because children in themselves won't have the ability to then enter into the moral way-ups and the moral discussions, right? They understand things. They understand things in terms of rewards versus benefits, right? We tell you that that's the way then you need to explain it to them and teach it to them if you want those children to get a moral lesson. So please note that none of them ever tell you that they don't want children to get moral lessons about being good and whether they ought to be good. We tell you that if you value children aspiring to goodness, we tell you that the way in which you need to teach them is in a simplified manner that they understand it. You speak about dichotomies. You don't give them the full moral vagueness, or you don't give the full sphere of choice where people can do different things and be good or bad, and they have to assess things and evaluate things and weigh up in order to identify who's good. We tell them that you need to give it to them or present it to them in the simplest forms. We tell you that the ways in which you do that don't necessarily have to be sexist, don't necessarily have to be racist, and we're happy to oppose, along with opposition, racist portrayals of evil and sexist portrayals of evil. But we tell you that doesn't necessarily in itself mean that you ought to oppose a dichotomy of good versus evil in the way that you teach moral lessons to children. We tell you that the age of them and the way in which they consume ideas is a very simplistic manner, and you always need to present moral lessons to children in a more simplistic manner in order for them to understand them and then carry them out into their own lives as they grow. And we tell you that as they grow, they do become more complex. They do start watching the kind of other things that you're talking about, where they get to see things about gray areas. But we tell you that at the age in which they engage with children's fiction, they are unable to make those way-ups, and that's at a level at them that you need to present it in the most simplified black and white form, which is essentially that there are harms that come with being bad, there are rewards that come with being evil. You want to always prioritize being evil. That's what we support. We tell you that that's the way that you teach those moral lessons, by presenting them in those dichotomies, and not necessarily by I'll take over.
Okay, so sir, please deal with the idea that good always wins out, and that you acquire that good based on your identity as opposed to reason, moral calculuses, and choices that are made by you.
Look, I already spoke to you that the way in which you identify goodness in many of those stories isn't necessarily by who those people are or the way in which they're born. It's about the way in which those people act, right? Those people act in good ways. So Mufasa acts in a bad way by killing his brother, right? Whereas Simba then fights him, right? Like, it's actions that determine those things, and kids then see those actions, and that's what determines how it is that you assess goodness versus badness in those stories. And we tell you that goodness versus badness may have to be taught to children in very one-dimensional ways, because that's the way in which it's easiest for them to consume it, right? That's something that you guys never deal with, right? You need to tell us why it is that it's bad to aspire. So we tell you that even in the instance that it provides them with false hope, like opening government tells you, we tell you that even then it's good, because even if you won't necessarily get the benefits, we tell you that goodness in itself is something that's always great to aspire to, right? So we tell you What we tell you is that the way in which you're going to have to assess this debate, when it is that you guys do the judging, is you're going to need to talk about the way in which you present moral lessons to children, and what lessons are good and what lessons are bad, right? And what we tell you from closing opposition is essentially that the way in which you present lessons to children in order to get them to act correctly and act or grow up with good moral actions is to present it in its most simplest forms, and that may very well mean that it's dichotomies, and it may very well mean that those aren't necessarily fully true within the status quo, but we tell you that even in that instance, that's better that those children are acting right, and they in themselves value goodness, even if the reasons in which they did that aren't necessarily good. And we tell you that those children don't necessarily abandon those lessons once they grow up, because those become inculcated ways, or inculcated into the way they behave and into the way they act. That means that they don't necessarily abandon them when they grow up and find out that things aren't the same in which it was presented in non-fictional things. So they keep the stories that they learned. So we tell you, for those reasons, we're happy to oppose.
We would like to thank the member of opposition, and now I'd like to welcome the government whip to sum up the government case.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This debate is not about whether good is good, but about how the portrayal of good triumphing over evil plays itself out and is received in the real world. So it's not a good look for Bash to come up here and give one response to our extension by saying we don't have to defend bigotry, we don't have to defend racism. That doesn't alleviate you of the burden to prove that good triumphing over evil as a dichotomy works out in a world where race doesn't exist, right? The fact that most of the children literature that you see is like Alice in Wonderland, Narnia, Winnie the Pooh, etc., in a particular language portraying particular social norms and written by particular white men. There you have to make considerations about what the stories they tell say about their complicity in the destruction of the world via their white hero savior complex. You have to engage what those stories tell black children, what they tell Arab children about what their society's value is in the world. The reason why Edward Said is so important in his attack of narratives via books like Aladdin is because of precisely the way that these stories orientalize people of color, precisely the way that these stories other those people of color. And so everything that Devon tells you is the backbone of their case about how life doesn't actually matter and we need hope is defeated when that hope comes in the form of objectifying, othering those people you were hoping to make subjects of. So you can't come here and give us every explanation you have for like, yeah, look, but there's a black princess. Yeah, look, but there's a poor person triumphing over evil. You have to engage the narrative created by children's literature which tells them not only that good is good and bad is bad, but that good always triumphs over evil. So it's important not just that you can be a good person and that children must be taught moral lessons, but the proximity that those children, based on their positionality in the world, have to ascertain that aspiration. So that as a black parent, you're still capable of making or teaching moral lessons to your children. But the fact of the matter is, you're not going to teach them that, like, we're all zebras and pigs and this and that, and we live in the world purple, green, and yellow. You're going to teach them that racism is going to traumatize you in a white school, as opposed to teaching them to be colorblind. Because moral lessons can still be taught via what is right and wrong, and not necessarily via a narrative that says good always triumphs over evil. So that when that black child walks into the street and is harassed by the police for no particular reason, their world is shattered. Or that for the third time that they try for that school South African team, they still can't thrive.
Order!
So then the question to ask in this debate, no way,
Order.
no way. The question to ask in this debate then is, as this narrative is created and transfused into the world, how is it received and what does it mean for the world and the foundations of how we live the world out in reality? In our extension particularly, we tell you that the way that we form heroes via this narrative is one that necessarily excludes and one that necessarily creates disillusionment, such that we find ourselves in a situation where black children are not the exception in the township school of debating, they internalize the hatred of the world against them as a hatred of themselves against themselves. When you're a black girl child in South Africa, you're more likely to be raped or killed than to learn how to read or write. Reading a princess story about how good triumphs over evil and is a result of you being beautiful even though you're Cinderella, or as a result of you being a princess and thereby being entitled to receiving good in the world, does nothing to contextualize the world for you. In fact, what it does do is mean that you go out in the world thinking, I'm a queen, black girl magic, and then the world tells you that you're 3/3 a person and you're shattered. But instead of engaging the world as it is systematically set up for you and your positionality, you internalize that hate when you are just in a queue about when am I going to be raped, when am I going to be violated as a result of coming from a township and living in a shack. The point then is, the world is fucked up because these narratives exist to structure our understanding of it. An understanding that, as Elisha tells you, is ahistorical, is not contextual, and is damaging. That's why you have the big brother complex via countries like the United States, who think it's our duty to go out into the third world and impose those things we think are good and ought to triumph in situations where you don't even understand how it is that those people come about moralizing their world, establishing their values, and coming to the context or circumstance that envelops them in the world in which they live. In finance terms, the world only as it really matters. So the exceptionalizing via this narrative of what is good, what is evil, but essentially how it is that good triumphs over evil, means that as a person who is not the hero, right? Who is not Superman with the curl on your muscles and your perfect archetypal white male body, is it says that in order to be a hero as a black person, you have to be exceptional. You must pick yourself up by your bootstraps Leave the world in which you live and aspire to something which 9.9 times out of 10 you are never, because of your structural positionality, ever going to be able to achieve. But it says to white people, because you look like Superman and you display the values of your world, you're generally entitled to all of the good things in life. Boy, I've never been so proud.
Panel. Government bench spent 28 minutes telling us why the configuration of what is good and what is bad is problematic. They spent absolutely no time telling us why the format of good versus bad is problematic in today's debate. What they need to engage is the format and not the configuration. Because all I have to do is concede to all of Athi and Elisha's matter and say, yes, the literature that black kids engage is problematic. Yes, the literature that white kids engage is problematic. But then we need to ask ourselves, is that regrettable in this instance? They gave us no analysis for that. Just by that, like debating 101 lesson, they should not be winning today's debate in that instance. What we tell you from closing opposition is that good and bad are universal, intrinsic human appeals, right? Like, what do you lose as a good child, as a black child, to be told there are rewards if you aspire to if you aspire to good actions and behaving in a morally acceptable way. They tell us the problem is that the configuration of what is morally acceptable that's taught to the black child is what's problematic. We tell you then, in that instance, what no one engaged in this debate, and by means of rebuttal, I tell you that the type of literature black kids engage is only dominant because of access to it, right? So what you need to regret is the access to that literature, not the existence of that literature in that instance. I tell you, I grew up reading quite a lot of like valuable black child literature that told me that as a black person, I'm going to grow up in a world that is not meant for me. As a black person, I'm going to grow up in a world that is incredibly harmful to like my future. I read Phyllis and watched the movie plenty times over, and I think that's incredibly valuable sort of literature that I was able to engage. So we tell you the problem is that black kids access literature written by Europeans. So what should be regrettable in this instance is that like the access to this literature is not widely spread and is like incredibly harmful in this instance. Beyond that, even when black kids do access bad literature, should we regret that? The answer is no, because what we tell you is that if Athi is so adamant about like black kids having to be taught about the problems they're going to face, is that when black kids see this white savior literature that they're reading, it creates a perverse incentive for their parents, for their communities, to engage them from that age, from an acceptable age, because these people expect too much from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, right? They expect them to engage these complexities, which like they don't have the cognitive capacity to do in that instance. What we tell you is that incentive is what's valuable. So in fact, that problematic literature becomes valuable, because what's factual in this debate is that the literature of white people is an extension of their values, is an extension of their political makeup. When black kids get to engage there, they get to realize the extension of white people's political, moral, and societal makeup. It then becomes our duty as woke people in this room and as woke societies that understands that this literature is problematic to engage these kids at like a grade 9 social science classroom. So we think it's important for black kids to know that a white boy is going to grow up thinking he's Superman, and he needs to be able to prepare through his conscientization in the society to be able to counter that. Because the fact is, white people are not going to stop being racist just because black kids don't access their literature. They're going to continue to be racist. Black kids just need to be able to be prepared for it in that instance. But what we tell you, like openly government speaks about this thing of why moral vagueness is important, and kids should be able to engage the moral outcomes of the literature by themselves. First of all, Bash gave scientific extensive analysis, which like the chosen government team gave us no engagement in, that the kids just don't have this moral capacity to engage this. So therefore, because kids can't really engage this internalization does not happen between the ages of 4 and 10, right? And we think that is incredibly important. No, sit down. This is incredibly important to consider in this instance. Why is that moral vagueness problematic in today's debate? Because we tell you that moral vagueness is the absence of moral rigidity. And here's why moral rigidity is valuable. Because even in the real world, there are clear instances of good and clear instances of bad. What you tell kids is that it should be vague and you should be willing to engage, is how you create the Musimamanis of the world that say maybe white people aren't evil, maybe we need to engage them, maybe black people are the problem. That's why this sort of value that's why this sort of rigidity in terms of what's rigidly good and rigidly bad is valuable in society, and particularly valuable for minorities in today's debate. We tell you that the clear bad and evil of the world of a black child is like white monopoly capital is as the bad, and the black plight as like the triumph that needs to be overcome. We tell you that the literature reflects that, and it's important that they consider that in today's debate. Now, Ati, I'm going to take you so you can get off me.
You're fucking Bash up because he tells us that this narrative is necessary to teach moral lessons. But you're saying you're saying that you don't have the capacity to see that racism exists, but you have as a child the tools to critique it. And then
sit down. Bash told you very clearly that what you need to teach a 5, 6, 7-year-old black child is that there's a conceptualization of good and bad. You need to aspire for good. That child is not going to engage the configuration of that good. All he knows at that age is that I must do what is good. It then becomes our communal extension duty to be able to challenge those configurations. No, Ati, sit down. So what Baston tells you is that black kids what he tells you is that because the only simplistic thing they can understand is that good exists, bad exists, but not the complexities because they don't have the cognitive capacity to deal with that. Panel, you cannot lose sight of that. It's almost scientific and a biological fact that they just ran away from entirely into today's debate. Actually, I have nothing more because there wasn't much on that, but I'm done.